And I'll go ahead and kick us off. Nice. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. Our second read-through, we're moving into the Civilized Capitalist Machine. I have no announcements today of any sort, but the big things, as I always say, follow us on Twitter, DNGQC on Twitter, or DGQC on Patreon if you want to support what we're doing. We are also slowly putting together our Divagations conference. If you have any interest in contributing to the study of wandering, that's the point. So please join us. We'd love to have you as a part of that, whether it's writing, facilitating, helping us think through things, or just listening to us, whatever it might be. We're slowly getting all that together. As we move into the civilized capitalist machine, we have just finished discussing the Urstaat, the despotic state, and the form that it first takes, the underlying representation and form of production that is required for us to seemingly have a society, this underlying element. And we move finally into the civilized capitalist machine. The first paragraph kicks it off nicely, but this is a discussion at this point about the new socius, the movement from the despotic to this element. And there's a lot in here. Every paragraph is going to be significantly worth us taking some time going through. Do not hesitate to ask questions. Write them in the chat. Everyone should be able to fully talk. Please take part, because this is where we start getting into the real meat of this. So I'll go ahead and read, and we'll just continue. The first great movement of deterritorialization appears with the overcoding performed by the despotic state, but it is nothing compared to the other great movement, the one that will be brought about by the decoding of flows. The action of decoded flows is not enough, however, to cause the new break to traverse and transform the socius. Not enough, that is, to induce the birth of capitalism. Decoded flows strike the despotic state with latency. They submerge the tyrant, but they also cause him to return in unexpected forms. They democratize him, oligarchize him, segmentalize him, monarchize him, and always internalize and spiritualize him. Well, on the horizon, there is the latent Urstaat, for the loss of which there is no consolation. It is now up to the state to recode as best it can, by means of regular or exceptional operations, the product of the decoded flows. Let us take the example of Rome. The decoding of the landed flows through the privatization of property, the decoding of the monetary flows through the formation of great fortunes, the decoding of the commercial flows through the development of commodity production, the decoding of producers through expropriation and proletarization. All the preconditions are present, everything is given, without producing a capitalism properly speaking, but rather a regime based on slavery. Or the example of feudalism. There again, private property, commodity production, the monetary afflux, the extension of the market, the development of towns, and the appearance of manorial ground, rent in money form, or of the contractual hiring of labor, do not by any means produce a capitalist economy, but rather a reinforcing of feudal offices and relations, at times a return to more primitive stages of feudalism, and occasionally even the reestablishment of a kind of slavery. And it is well known that the monopolistic action favoring the guilds and the companies promotes not the rise of capitalist production, but the insertion of the bourgeoisie into a town and state feudalism that consists in devising codes for flows that are decoded as such, and in keeping the merchants, according to Marx's formula, in the very pores of the old full body of the social machine. Hence, capitalism does not lead to the dissolution of feudalism, but rather the contrary, and that is why so much time was required between the two. There is a great difference in this respect between the despotic age and the capitalist age, for the founders of the state come like lightning. The despotic machine is synchronic, while the capitalist machine's time is diachronic. the capitalists appear in succession in a series that institutes a kind of creativity of history, a strange menagerie, the schizoid time of the new creative break. Let's talk through. To me, this paragraph, as I read through it, is having the discussion about this idea that we kind of went from feudal to one form of economy to another, that it's this popover, or even that capitalism itself had elements throughout all of this. I think it's sort of one of those things gets lost in a lot of debate bro conversations as well when they start talking about what is actually capitalism, what is the setup and the way things are produced and organized. And very often people go back on the idea of it's private property, or it's corporations, or it's these elements, things that have, as he talks about through here, things we have had through centuries, if not millennia, in one form or another. So what elements of these are actually the things that make it up? When does it start? When does capitalism come in? What is these things are making? Is it capital, or is it something sort of between? And it's this transitory period is what it seems he's pointing at to me, where we're talking through that the dissolution of feudalism is what led to capitalism, that there is this period and switch as the despotic age and the capitalist age sort of exchange, but it's not any of these single elements that does such a thing. Again, sort of pointing towards their project of a universalized history. That's how I read through this, if that makes sense.
So in some respects, the capitalism is a continuation of the despotic machine, which is submerged, right? But it's the earth type is submerged in these different forms of political ideology, whether it's socialism or democracy or whatever. It just submerged, but it's what he calls a latency of the despotic machine. But it's there, it continues to be there. Right?
Yeah, these elements don't go away. And he talks sort of through them, these elements that we have that come from that, but where Rome had a regime based on slavery, we have all of these pieces. The preconditions are present. Everything is given without producing a capitalism, properly speaking. It's what actually makes it? What actually produces this capitalism? What actually makes this secondary element sort of come about? And that's this question they're raising here. Is what is this element? What is the thing? What is the elements that make it capitalism and not these other bits? And they've been hinting sort of towards this a great deal, but it's the decoding of flows, the nature itself of these things take a while. The decoded flows strike the despotic state with latency. They submerge the tyrant, but they cause him to return in unexpected forms. These decoded flows that take place underneath the despotic, which we went through, there's still decoded flows. They just all flow through him. They cause the despot to go away, no longer the pharaoh. Now he returns, either they democratize him, like we've done in America, they oligarchize him, which they've done in Russia, they segmentalize, monarchize, he becomes back a king, a president, whatever it is. But there is that despotic element. The horizon has that latent Urstadt, the latency that follows is kind of one of their big sort of points here.
I'm interested in the other sorts of decoded flows that are mentioned besides capitalism. I mean, obviously Marxism is an overarching theme here, socialism, the like, but I like that it's kind of obscure, that there are varieties of flows there. That kind of leaves it open for dispute or interpretation.
Yeah, the flows that basically he's talking through all the elements and things that flow within any socius, even the despotic, the monetary, land, money, fortunes, commercial flows, commodity flows, labor flows, literally all the parts that sort of make up what is the production of a society. And we can think of it very much in the same way as the flows of desire within the unconscious. I mean, they're intended to be more than slightly similar. And so as we code desire and as we do such things, there's elements as things sort of move forward. And the sort of danger with that is as these flows move and become coded, why we code them, how they get coded, what is sort of doing the coding and how they're getting sort of laid up as such is the fascinating part. And to your point, the types of flows, the way that in this case, desire, it being desire flows, but in the socius, there's many flows. Understanding all of them and talking through how they get decoded or recoded and sort of move through that is fascinating too.
I think it's almost limiting to say that it's limited, that it's only desire flows as well. I think that, you know, obviously the movement of merit and necessity, that's like just the most basic flows of the body, body without organs, of any kind of body, you know.
How so?
Well, for instance, just the need that's produced by maybe society. I don't know. The socius, the need that's produced by the socius and the shortcomings therein, and then, you know, the forthcoming fulfillment of those needs that the body mandates. I think is I think it's like that it doesn't just pertain to what we desire or what is given to us. It's like also like, you know, it's kind of a self-promoting, self-creation, self-determinant element. It's I feel like I'm really having diarrhea of the mouth right now, but
so when I say desire, I mean it specifically in the sense that they're using throughout this book, as well as a series of other pieces they've written, which is the core sort of essence of movement within the unconscious, the thing that is both the power of and created by inside of the way the desiring machines function. So there is only within the unconscious the flows of desire. They may change their representational state as they sort of emerge into the subject and beyond the subject, where they enter into the socius. But the functionality and production of flows and how anti-production sort of works within that from chapters 1 and especially 2 very much are about desire being the only thing that comes from the bottom up. But when I say bottom, I mean base, the plane of immanence. Whereas within the socius, we can think of the same essence, but almost its own version of the process, where the desiring machine desires, it connects, it produces desire, records desire, and then in such, the subject is formed in the miraculating machine. This process, as it moves, enlarged to the next level. If we just raise it up and stamp it again, all of the desires of the subject become the subject. And at that point, the flows that happen from the subject out are constituted. And those flows then become coded by the socius in the same process. It's the subject goes out, connects, disconnects, does different things. In that, the flows are made in the moment of connection, disconnection. They generate, they move forward, they're recorded in not the BWO, but instead the socius in this case. And the large scale sort of secondary oppressions come in from that state. Well, just like the BWO can be our servant or our master, the socius has the exact same ability. It's what organizes ultimately the flows of production. So it's a very specific lineage I'm talking through here when I say that.
Right on. Yeah, I actually just went over this chapter last night, so this is fresh for me.
Yeah, no, we're kind of hitting into the second half of that, because again, and I don't think I've read a lot of secondary sources who have the same interpretation I do on this point. But what I know that a lot of the secondary sources agree on is this idea of the two regimes. And so when we talk through and we spend the first half of the book going through the machinic unconscious, how it functions, how desire is produced, where it's produced, how it gets formed, how representations steal away or trap that desire, malform it, and then the subject is made. In this very same sense, we have this sort of subjectivity of the society and the socius that is produced in very much the same flows. So when we're talking about these points of elements or these representations of things that he's running through here to be very specific. The socius that existed within Rome had a great deal of the same flows. There's still the flows and decoding of monetary flows, decoding of commercial flows, private property and landed flows, the renter class, all of that. But ultimately, those pieces didn't produce capitalism. And that's, I think, the argument that this paragraph is making is we like to talk, or commonly people talk, about how the free market or private property or this produced capitalism or made us into a capitalist society. And the argument in this is saying, like, look, we've had these pieces. These are not the things that produce capitalism. Capitalism as a socius, as a alternate method of organizing the flows of the society and the socius that it's controlling, organization of production, these elements are still there in previous socii, specifically inside of the feudal system or Rome or these other bits. So they're not what produce capitalism. Instead, we need to really spend some time talking through what produces a socius and allows it to sort of exist, because nothing exists in a transcendental way. Capitalism didn't just spring forth from Zeus's forehead. There's a thing here and a break, a creativity break, the schizoid time of the new creative break, as he's talking about, sort of at the end here. And this is kind of his big reference. The line, hence capitalism does not lead to the disillusion of feudalism, which is very much a common sort of tropey thing. That's what I was taught in high school. That, oh, it's a good thing we got capitalism because that ended all of these bad things. But rather the contrary, disillusion of feudalism led to capitalism. And that is why so much time is required between the two. We have huge swaths of time with other pieces being formed and other things coming about. Sorry to ramble a bit. This paragraph is a pretty extraordinary sort of breakdown of that type of thing.
I think that's what I was trying to say, but
no, it's
I think that's what I said. I said that.
Literally, my part-time job is reading through this and talking about it. So, and I'm probably not even speaking about it entirely correctly in and of itself, or there's probably smarter things to say around this. This is not like a finality document of here's our Bible, but more pointing at these things. I keep going back to the allegory that for me, for Oedipus and how it organizes and controls us within capital. I believe the Urstadt has the same sort of representational quality of haunting in the shadows and waiting, but there's nothing I have that backs that up. I just think it's a good idea and it seems to match intuitively. So there's a lot of shit. If I say stuff, I may be completely wildly off. So don't worry. It's a whole thing. Like I like to tell people, go back and listen to the first 5 or 6 recordings that we had over a year ago. And I'm genuinely clueless on this. I just happen to have been fortunate enough to spend a year and a half doing nothing but this. So it makes it easier.
Well, I'm glad you're doing it. Thanks.
Well, trying to, and keep coming, because forcing me to explain stuff, and then probably someone will listen to this as we get, and they'll come to the Discord and tell me why I'm wrong, which is great. And then I get to learn a little bit and argue with them, and then we all come out a little bit better, is the hope, at least for me. Yeah, it's a fascinating little sort of bit that they've got here. And it's worth jumping to the next sort of smaller paragraph. I'm going to read through it really quick because it kind of continues that thought I was running with. Because we're talking at this point, the disillusions at this point of the elements that made up the feudalistic society, the disillusion of feudalism that led to capitalism. The disillusions are defined by a simple decoding of flows, and they are always compensated by residual forces or transformations of the state. Death is felt rising from within, and desire itself becomes the death instinct, latency. But it also passes over into these flows that carry the seeds of a new life. Decoded flows, but who will give a name to this new desire? Flows of property that is sold, flows of money that circulate, flows of production and means of production making ready in the shadows, flows of workers becoming deterritorialized. The encounter of all these flows will be necessary, their conjunction and their reaction on one another, and the contingent nature of this encounter, this conjunction and this reaction which occur one time, in order for capitalism to be born and for the old system to die this time from without, at the same time as the new life begins and desire receives its name. The only universal history is the history of contingency. Let us return to this eminently contingent question that modern historians know how to ask. Why Europe? Why not China? Apropos of ocean navigation, Fernand Braudel asks, why not Chinese, Japanese, or even Muslim ships? Why not Sinbad the Sailor? It is not the technique, the technical machine that is lacking. Isn't it rather that desire remains caught in the nets of the despotic state, entirely invested in the despot's machine? Perhaps then the merit of the West, confined as it was in its narrow Cape of Asia, was to have needed the world, to have needed to venture outside its own front door. The schizophrenic voyage is the only kind there is. Later, this will be the American meaning of frontiers, something to go beyond, limits to cross over, flows to set in motion, non-coded spaces to enter. The full decoding of these flows is kind of the point here, the conception where private property becomes its own flow. Not that we're coding it as private property and the flow comes in, it's like, oh, we got all this land, we're going to code it as such. But it's the fully decoded flows of such a thing freely able to match and go up against the free flows of money and production and all these elements that coalesce. They only need to one time, and then now we have capitalism, this contingent moment. I have to make a comment on there's a whole bunch of stuff in here that I know Gehring and a handful of other people on the server shudder a little bit at the not just some slight tinge of Orientalism, but the fact that they're going off of, we will say, some dated work when it comes to understanding the world of Asian culture, China, Japan, and all of that. One of the reasons we know historically, one second, jet is going overhead. Well, and it flew away. That's easy. One of the reasons that why not Chinese, Japanese, or even Muslim ships? There were one of the really fun parts of India, and specifically how capital ended up conquering India during a more feudal time with the East India Company, is India found it cheaper because the East India Company and British ships offered to rent their ships effectively, or rent their navy to the area to defend India. And so as such, and they never bothered to build their own navy. There's these really weird sort of moments throughout history, like such a thing, that helped kick certain things into certain directions. And I'd love if someone had a better sort of grasp or understanding of such histories to be able to like really correct some of this. The sentiment I don't think is wrong. I think the facts are, but I don't think the sentiment is terribly wrong. This idea of the old system dying from without, the need for exploration to be a sort of drive, and the fact that the only movement forward, the only type of voyage, the frontier, is only schizophrenic, because by nature you don't know the thing. You can't go on a paranoiac voyage into the unknown. Like, that's the opposite, is I think kind of the joke they have here.
So yeah, maybe not in relation to all of the Orientalism stuff, but an association I get here is, and I posted this already in the chat, because I'm currently rereading Michel Serres' The Parasite, and it really helps to have read other stuff like this, I would say, to understand it. And it really much reminds me of his notion of this universal exchanger of something like a general equivalent that is money, for example, in the capitalistic system, because it is not something that has a value to itself. It is not material. So it is not something sacred anymore, or something that belongs to a specific realm, something that isn't that is untouchable in this sense, but it has this tendency, as we see here with in the emergence of the capitalistic system, that something, or better to say anything in the despotic state, becomes slowly decoded. Everything gets on the same level, on the same plane, becomes exchangeable. And by that, gets ripped off its sacred values, of its material aspects. Anything can stand for anything. So by that, it has this power of making everything equal, but everything becomes tasteless in a specific sense as well. So it is this blank thing in a exchange that only lives for itself, to consume everything around it, because it has not this intensive relationship anymore. It just tries to expand and expand, to keeps this circulation going that goes faster and faster, because there is no not exchange, but then there are no more gifts in this sense in a purely capitalistic society. A gift in the sense of, for example, Marcel Mauss ideas, or something other French theorists would talk about.
Even worse, there's only debts. There's only debts.
Yeah, there is not anymore this genuine social aspect to it. There's only this total blank and debt exchange to it.
Well, and with that, because it's a wonderful connection to make, anyone, Michel Serres, I don't think I could recommend an author more. I've been rediving back into a few texts. The idea of this universal moment and the decoded, this decoded flows is the reference to what Triad's talking about. Spot on. It's everything. If you look around you right now, we live in a place where you could just assign a number to a thing. And when I say that, if you have a computer or a device in front of you that's worth 100, 500, 1,000 things, like dollars, like everything land is decoded. It's just the flows of it. Oh, that's $400,000. That's 600,000. Everything becomes universalized under this one regime of representation that is the dollar. And that universalized element is the thing that allows the decoded flows, because now it's not that I have a piece of land. My dad used to say, you don't buy a house, you buy a home. But if you don't believe in, say, landlords and such things, you're buying not a house, you're buying a home. Conversely, the decoded version of a home would be a house, or ultimately the fully decoded version of privatized land is dollar amounts. This is worth this much, this is worth this much, and that's how they move through society. It's 100% what Triad's talking about. It's a fascinating sort of shift as capitalism gets born, because we get to have this, all the flows come together into one thing, and that is capital. All flows ultimately just become capital.
So you're saying that originally the desires were coded, right, according to social relations and so forth. But capitalism decodes those and quantifies everything according to this debtor and credit, relationship, and it's quantified into dollar amounts.
Yeah, it's fuck. That's the next paragraph. I'm just going to let you lead me right into it. I'm going to read the next paragraph now. Decoded desires and desires for decoding have always existed. History is full of them. But we have just seen that only through their encounter in a place and their conjunction in a space that takes time do decoded flows constitute a desire that instead of just dreaming or lacking it, actually produces a desiring machine that is at the same time social and technical. That is why capitalism and its break are defined not solely by decoded flows, but by the generalized decoding of flows, the new massive deterritorialization, the conjunction of deterritorialized flows. It is the singular nature of this conjunction that ensured the universality of capitalism. By simplifying a lot, we can say that the savage territorial machine operated on the basis of connections of production, and that the barbarian despotic machine was based on disjunctions of inscription derived from the immanent unity. But the capitalist machine, the civilized machine, will first establish itself on the conjunction. When this occurs, the conjunction no longer merely designates remnants that have escaped coding or consummations consumptions as in the primitive feasts or even the maximum consumption in the extravagance of the despot and his agents. When the conjunction moves to the fore in the social machine, it seems on the contrary that it ceases to be tied to enjoyment or to the excess consumption of a class, that it makes luxury itself into a means of investment and reduces all the decoded flows to production in a production for production's sake that rediscovers the primitive connections of labor on condition, on the sole condition, that they be linked to capital and to the new deterritorialized full body, the true consumer from whence they seem to emanate, as in the pact with the devil that Marx describes, the industrial eunuch. So it's your fault if... it felt like, JK, that paragraph basically was exactly like answering what you were talking about and going through it. Tell me if I'm wrong, but that felt like almost direct. And it's the thing that I find... one of the things that I love about this moment also is we start talking about, again, to go back to how the unconscious and the machinic nature of it is intended to be, when we're all one and we're talking about the regime of the molar versus the molecular, which we will get a lot more into very shortly. But when we talk about how desire moves and desiring machines are part of the unconscious, here they say very clearly, the conjunction in a space takes time. In this place, do decoded flows constitute a desire that instead of dreaming or lacking, which is kind of the despotic or the old way of how sort of a subject would deal with a desire that exists, constituted post-subject, actually here produces a desiring machine that is at the same time social and technical. This is the social or technical machines of the socius. This is one of the things that's very unique of capitalism, that by having these flows and this moment created, there's a new flow, and this sort of combinatory nature of it is itself its own sort of social machine. And as such, just like desiring machines, has many parts, fits, breaks, starts, all these things that it's connected to. But ultimately, this larger thing plays itself on the conjunction. It sits there. It waits for this, all of these things to sort of come together, this imminent unity that he talks about here, which I love that phrasing. And ultimately, this production for production's sake that comes out of that, the industrial eunuch. And there's a quote from Marx I'm going to go find the footnote of, but I'll let someone else speak for a moment.
I guess for me it comes a bit more together now, because before that, Deleuze and Guattari are talking about this history of contingency, and that the encounter of all these flows will be necessary, their conjunction and their reaction on one another. So it's like, at first, all of the coded flows get pulled together to the center of the despot. They come to some extent in this... almost in this gravitational force encountered with each other, so they clash together. They have to manage their different flows with each other, and at a specific point, all of these dynamics become more powerful, and this soul production and this pure crossing of different flows becomes more powerful than the despotic power itself, and it gets overthrown by this. And then this attracting force becomes more like an expansive force, because there is no despot anymore. There's only this vague desire for expansion, for more flows, for more exchange and circulation in this solely energy of just producing more and more.
And I'm going to read a little bit from a little bit of that Karl Marx guy. The need for money is therefore the true need produced by the economic system, and it is the only need which the latter produces. The quantity of money becomes to an ever greater degree its sole effective quality. Just as it reduces everything to its abstract form, so it reduces itself in the course of its own movement to quantitative being. Excess and intemperance come to be its true norm. Subjectively, this appears partly in the fact that the extension of products and needs becomes a contriving and ever-calculating subservience to inhuman, sophisticated, unnatural, and imaginary appetites. Private property does not know how to change crude need into human need. Its idealism is fantasy, caprice, and whim, and no eunuch flatters his despot more basely or uses more despicable means to stimulate his dulled capacity for pleasure in order to sneak a favor for himself than does the industrial eunuch, the producer, in order to sneak for himself a few pieces of silver, in order to charm the golden birds out of the pockets of his dearly beloved neighbors in Christ. He puts himself at the service of the other's most depraved fancies, plays the pimp between him and his need, excites in him morbid appetites, lies in wait for each of the weaknesses, all so that he can then demand the cash for his service of love. Dear friend, I give you what you need, but you know the conditio sine qua non. You know the ink in which you have to sign yourself over to me. In providing for your pleasure, I fleece you. That's the industrial eunuch in Marx. A wonderful piece. I love that last bit especially. Specifically, that is from the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. Human Requirements and Division of Labor under the Rule of Private Property is the section.
Thank you.
I'll actually, Marxist.org, by the way, if anyone wants to ever find anything Marx wrote. They have a wonderful archive that's very easy and quick to search. But there's the link, second and third paragraph. But the whole thing is worth reading. I mean, he has so many great pieces, but this is one that I like because I much prefer, whenever I hear Fox News say the producers, which is a Ayn Rand term, the creators, the job creators, whatever, all I can think is industrial eunuch. And makes it easier to tolerate Bezos when you think he's a eunuch. It's kind of funny.
Thus the rocket ship being shaped the way it was.
Yeah, I mean, it just helps. It just fits a lot of things that are happening. Had to build himself a giant dick because he is an industrial eunuch.
The ultimate lifted truck.
There you go. But to go back to the part really that while we were answering JK sort of with this section, the thing he's talking about here again, and they go back to it, this isn't just that there are decoded desires. That's not it. That's a part of it for sure. But decoded desires have always been there. Specifically the conjunction that takes time at that conjunction, that moment. This is where capitalism sort of sits. The machine sits at that conjunction where these desires, all these flows come together. And right there at that moment where labor flows and tech flows and creative flows and land flows and blah, 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 and all that crap, whatever it may be, all those things come together in that conjunction right there, that moment. I think of the prism, and it's almost a reverse of that, all of the different colors of the spectrum coming together to a singular white light. And at that moment, the prism, that's the nature of this social technical machine, this element that is bringing them together. That conjunction is what they're talking about, that all of the elements have these exceptionally decoded flows. And everything gets reduced ultimately to production. Production for production's sake, as they say in quotes. As long as everything's linked back to capital, like we're done. We're on the other side of the veil at that point. Anything can be added. Doesn't matter. Slavery can be added, and it has been to capital. That's great. That doesn't matter. Labor's labor. We're on the other side. And all that matters now is that things get linked to capital. That's the big deal at this point. It's no longer the pieces. Once that ultimate mass of decoded flows has come together and the machine has been created, we're in it. There you go. Doesn't matter at this point. Have fun. Any thoughts, comments? Anyone else, please? At the heart of capital, Marx points to the encounter of two principal elements, On one side, the deterritorialized worker who has become free and naked, having to sell his labor capacity. On the other, decoded money that has become capital and is capable of buying it. The fact that these two elements result from the segmentation of the despotic state in feudalism and from the decomposition of the feudal system itself and that of its state still does not give us the extrinsic conjunction of these two flows, flows of producers and flows of money. The encounter might not have taken place, with the free workers and the money capital existing virtually side by side. One of the elements depends on a transformation of the agrarian structures that constitute the old social body, while the other depends on a completely different series going by way of the merchant and the usurer, as they exist marginally in the pores of this old social body. What is more, each of these elements brings into play several processes of decoding and deterritorialization having very different origins. For the free worker, the deterritorialization of the soil through privatization, the decoding of the instruments of production through appropriation, the loss of the means of consumption through the dissolution of the family and the corporation, and finally, the decoding of the worker in favor of the work itself or of the machine. And for capital, the deterritorialization of wealth through monetary abstraction, the decoding of the flows of production through merchant capital, the decoding of states through financial capital and public debts, the decoding of the means of production through the formation of industrial capital, and so on. I'm going to assume that means no one has any questions at all and everyone completely understands every part of this, which is good. It's very good. Really, it is a continuation of what we have been talking about and continuing to make the point that it's not just any one of these two elements. And he's really trying to drive this point home, that it's this hyper-contingency. Again, history isn't something that just sort of happens. There's these deeply contingent moments that allow these bursts of movement forward. And it's not just that we have labor on one side and capital on the other. That's great. We probably had that at another point. A lord telling a jester, dance for me, and throwing coin at him is effectively the same interaction. That's not at all what we're talking about. It doesn't work the same way and doesn't operate at a societal level in the same way. These things have probably been side by side before, virtually, I think he says. One of the elements depends on the transformation of the structures. We've got to change those. The other depends completely on a different series, going by way of the merchant and usurer, as they exist marginally in the pores of this old social body. The shift of usury, which was even something that was seen to be gross once upon a time, and beneath the holy people and all of that. There's a lot of these changes. He's, again, talking about the hyper-contingency sort of these things. Am I close there? Ben, Triad, anyone? Generally?
Yeah, I would say so. And in this paragraph, it becomes clear that both of these principles are not coming from nowhere, but it is, again, this succession and this development of these accelerations almost of already existing tendencies in the ways things happen before, although there's still some kind of phase shift, because the worker gets deterritorialized, and by that he becomes free and naked. So a worker that might have been working on a field or for its own livelihood or that of the despot for generations now has to work in the city in a factory and does things he couldn't would have never imagined, and is just replaceable and can produce anything because he just has to do very minor and mind-numbing tasks that are just split up through so many workers, and there's this sort of alienation to it. Yeah, and then this decoded money that is flowing more and more and just there to be exchanged, and not anymore just buying something to live from.
Let us consider more in detail how the elements come together with the conjunction of all their processes. It is no longer the age of cruelty or the age of terror, but the age of cynicism accompanied by a strange piety, the two taken together constitute humanism. Cynicism is the physical immanence of the social field, and piety is the maintenance of the spiritualized Urstaat. Cynicism is capital as a means of extorting surplus labor, but piety is the same capital as God capital, whence all the forces of labor seem to emanate. This age of cynicism is that of the accumulation of capital, an age that implies a period of time precisely for the conjunction of all the decoded and deterritorialized flows. As Maurice Daub has shown, an accumulation of property title deeds in land, for example, will be necessary in a first period of time in the favorable conjuncture, at a time when this property costs little, the disintegration of the feudal system. A second period is required when the property is sold during a rise in prices, and under conditions that make industrial investment especially advantageous. The price revolution, an abundant reserve supply of labor, the formation of a proletariat, and easy access to sources of raw materials, favorable conditions for the production of tools and machinery. All sorts of contingent factors favor these conjunctions. So many encounters for the formation of the thing, the unnameable. But the effect of the conjunction is indeed capital's tighter and tighter control over production. Capitalism, or its break, the conjunction of all the decoded and deterritorialized flows, cannot be defined by commercial capital or by financial capital, these being merely flows among other flows and elements among other elements, but rather by industrial capital. Doubtless, the merchant was very early an active factor in production, either by turning into an industrialist himself in occupations based on commerce, or by making artisans into his own intermediaries or employees, the struggle against the guilds and the monopolies. But capitalism doesn't begin. The capitalist machine is not assembled until capital directly appropriates production, and until financial capital and merchant capital are no longer anything but specific functions corresponding to a division of labor in the capitalist mode of production in general. One then re-encounters the production of productions, the production of recordings, and the production of consumptions. But precisely in this conjunction of decoded flows that makes the capital the new social full body, whereas commercial and financial capitalism, in its primitive forms, merely installed itself in the pores of the old socius without changing the old mode of production. This is a critique to me of the definition of capital and what capital is, and to have a discussion about how to fix or stop capitalism or whatever it is, we have to be able to sit here and define it. And their argument here, as it has been for the last few paragraphs, and I tend to follow through this, is not simply saying it's having money, it's buying things, it's private property, it's selling property. It's like these elements are things that have been around. There's more to it that makes capitalism have the power it has. And specifically, it's the appropriation of flows and the production itself, the organization of it, that makes capitalism what it is and how it functions, is how I read through this. There's some great little lines in here we can go through, but that's the gist, I think. Anyone else have a different take?
Yeah, I agree, because as they write at the end, but precisely in this conjunction of decoded flows that makes of capital the new social full body. So it is something that takes over this whole social body, and as you can see in other fields in our late capitalistic society, everything becomes decoded by this, and everything gets appropriated by the logistics or the logos of the capitalistic mindset, so to speak, or of this notion of production for production. When you see how politics operates, mass media, even science and art, everything becomes more and more industrialized and capitalized in this sense. There's merely a overabundance of rehashed ideas, and this diachronic aspect that was described earlier, that there's not solely this production for someone's own sake, but for the system as a whole.
Bostgerd says, curious about what he means with the difference between financial capitalism and industrial capitalism. I don't think I'm getting it right, but it makes them seem mutually exclusive.
It sort of is. Okay. So quick kind of like economic history lesson, right? So you have back in the 1960s in America, you have the dollar. It is backed by American gold, right? Like, boom, done. But you also have this establishing market that is trading more or less virtual dollars for barrels of oil. And this sort of like second currency has become like the de facto default currency upon which all international banking transitions are based, and it creates sort of like this like second like fiat capital market. Eventually we end the like material backed currency in America, go on a fiat dollar, but it's still the same thing, whereas the money in your wallet is different than the money being used to finance venture capital. The velocity of that money is different. The way that it moves through the market is different. What it does is different. Like, your money is still money that is based in and around like representations of production and like transferring material resources from person to person and sort of acting as a stand-in in that kind of commerce, but it's still not the same as like financial capital, where the dollars are more or less completely divorced from anything, and the most important aspect is the velocity of the dollar.
That's a great explanation of it. A way I might also say, and I wonder if you'd agree, Ben, is industrial capital still almost has a mediator involved when it comes to how capital utilizes labor. We're talking about a switch where financial capitalism, capital directly owns all of it. So the shift is significant. That's more how I am understanding. Am I close, Ben? Your explanation was just great. I just want to ask if my wording is okay.
I mean, I think we're saying pretty much the same thing.
All right, cool. Making sure, because it's such a fascinating switch, and it's a tough one for people who, like, the last 60 years, like the capitalism I've known my whole life. I'm 40. The capitalism I've known my whole life hasn't, like, it's changed, but it's generally been financial capitalism. I came up during Reagan and Reaganomics, and that sort of changed. Before that, it's different. It's a different type of capital. There's a handful of really amazing books on it. I want to say Lazzarato has actually written on it very well. The Violence of Financial Capitalism, I want to say, is the title. Crap, I'm going to have to find it. That goes into the distinction pretty significantly.
There we go. I guess like the one line that keeps tripping me up is that it says that until capital directly appropriates production, and until financial capital and merchant capital are no longer anything but specific functions corresponding to a division of labor and capitalist mode of production in general. I've never seen financial capitalism as a specific function. It seems to instead be almost a contestant of industrial capitalism at times. It's less maybe a question about the text and more about its applicability to the present. So I might hold off for the next paragraph that might inform a little bit.
It's actually a very good point and I'm not sure I have an answer off the top of my head. It's a Christian Marazzi, by the way. Christian Marazzi is the one who wrote Violence of Financial Capitalism. It's a wonderful summary of financial capitalism. I have it open. I'm looking for a section, I think, answer.
The use of the term production of consumption, right? Is that a reference to like manufacturing, consent, manufacturing desire? I think that's a Noam Chomsky term, manufacturing consent. But it reminds me of also the idea of manufacturing or creating desires for the consumption of goods. before they even produce.
So to go back to Bostgerd's question, when we talk about capital as a gigantic socius, and we are here, we're not talking about it as a functionary or a singular machine. We're talking about the concept of it actually organizing all flows in the same way that effectively Oedipus organizes a great deal of flows of desire that move through, or anything within our unconscious. The socius organizes all flows, but we don't get to the point of capital being the socius, capitalism, as he's saying here. The full machine doesn't get assembled until capital fully appropriates production, and that includes financial capital and merchant capital are no longer anything but specific functions corresponding to a division of labor in the capitalist mode of production in general. It's these last two words I think are important to my understanding of the sentence. The essence of financial capital can't be a component or an empower thing that is able to itself directly control labor or other elements. Just like merchant capital, if we want to go there, or industrial capital, or any of these elements as well. Merchants in these elements have always been part of production, and they're the ones who effectively become the moderated element between capital. Capital gets moderated through somebody who is the merchant, who is the one who then moderates it, codes it, changes it into something. It needs to be direct. And we have moved into, and I've understood the term financial capital, financial capitalism, specifically to be this larger new socius and this form. I think the usage here is a little bit different, and more the financial capital is a direct line at the banks or investment houses in general. The term, as a lot of what Marazzi writes, I think is an evolution of this. Again, the times have shifted. In this time period, capital wasn't a thing that wholly subsumed everything and controlled everything. Financial capital is ultimately, if we want to talk about like the king of all kings, it is the thing that owns all of the formations of production within our society. It's all done for that. It's not a thing that people foresaw in those days, especially pre-Reagan. There was the banks and the investments over here, merchant stuff over here. Investment didn't even cross. In most countries, it didn't for a very long time, but even in America, investment didn't cross over into banks directly or into merchants in the same way that it does today. So I think the reference here is less to the financial capital as the term I'm saying, and more them aiming at the banks or merchant capital are no longer anything but specific functions corresponding to a division of labor in the capitalist mode of production. Does that make sense, Boast? To read Boast, yeah, because there were financial crises in Deleuze's time, so I don't think they would have been completely surprised by 2008. They're not speaking about it specifically here. I think they wouldn't have been surprised by it happening, but I think, again, the financial crises that happened back then weren't global in the way 2008 was. I mean, even the dot-com explosion that sort of took down a lot of people in America wasn't even close to what 2008 was. That was a global meltdown of a financial system that was like, it was a wholly different beast. And again, so hyper-connected and so indebted to capital as a thing itself that it kind of stepped beyond what they're talking about into that step where really capital has directly appropriated literally everything. We call it financial capital because ultimately the finance sector is at the king about all of that stuff. And the one who's sort of, controlling those flows, if there is a such thing, or the machine and how it's built, perhaps I think would be a better way to say it. It's the machine that's currently winning. Maybe it might be a better way to put it.
Yep, that makes sense to me. And I think that I'm satisfied with my understanding of it at this point, which is nice because it actually kind of is food for thought, not a discrepancy in the text or a discrepancy in my understanding, I guess, which is even better.
That's a great question because it's one that I think I would recommend. I was just reading through and kind of got a little bit of insight on that. Christian Marazzi's The Violence of Financial Capitalism. It's a semiotext series. Tiny little book, 100% worth purchasing. It's totally PDF'd everywhere. We'll toss it up in the server. With phenomenal piece that really talks through that as well. one of the really big important lines. I mean, there's so many great lines in this paragraph. But after all that, everything we've talked through, the division of labor in general, one then re-encounters the production of productions, the production of recordings, and the production of consumptions, but precisely in this conjunction of decoded flows that makes of capital the new social full body. Whereas commercial and financial capitalism in its primitive forms merely installed itself in the pores of the old socius without changing the old mode of production. This line and set of three elements here, the production of production, recordings, and consumptions, these will come back. I just want to make sure I sort of put a pin in that so everyone sort of notices. These elements will come back. Even before the capitalist production machine is assembled, commodities and money affect a decoding of flows through abstraction. But this does not occur in the same way for both instances. First, simple exchange inscribes commercial products as particular quanta of a unit of abstract labor. It is abstract labor, posited in the exchange relation, that forms the disjunctive synthesis of the apparent movement of commodities, since the abstract labor is divided into qualified pieces of labor to which a given determinate quantum corresponds. But it is only when a general equivalent appears as money, just mentioning Sarah's there triad, just mentioning, as money, that one enters into the reign of the quantitas, which can have all sorts of particular values or be worth all sorts of quanta. This abstract quantity, nonetheless, must have some particular value, so that it still appears only as a relation of magnitude between quanta. It is in this sense that the exchange relation formally unites partial objects that are produced and even inscribed independently of it. The commercial and monetary inscription remains overcoded and even repressed by the previous characteristics and modes of inscription of a socius considered in its specific mode of production, which knows nothing of and does not recognize abstract labor. As Marx says, the latter is indeed the simplest and most ancient relation of productive activity, but it does not appear as such and only becomes a true practical relation in the modern capitalist machine. That is why, before, the monetary and commercial inscription does not have a body of its own at its disposal, why it is inserted into the interstices of the pre-existing social body. The merchant is continually speculating with the maintained territorialities so as to buy where prices are low and sell where they are high. Before the capitalist machine, merchant or financial capital is merely in a relationship of alliance with non-capitalist production. It enters into a new alliance that characterizes pre-capitalist states, whence the alliance of the merchant and banking bourgeoisie with feudalism. In brief, the capitalist machine begins when capital ceases to be a capital of alliance to become a filiative capital. Capital becomes filiative when money begets money, or value a surplus value. Quote, value in process, money in process, and, as such, capital, value, suddenly presents itself as an independent substance, endowed with a motion of its own in which money and commodities are mere forms which it assumes and casts off in turn. Nay, more, instead of simply representing the relations of commodities, it enters now, so to say, into relations with itself. It differentiates itself as original value from itself as surplus value, as the Father differentiates himself qua the Son, yet both are one and of one age, for only by the surplus value of £10 does the £100 originally advanced become capital. But first, triad. For sure. I mean, come on. General equivalent appears as money. I mean, you jumped the gun a little bit.
Yeah, I'm glad that you reminded me, so I can note SAS just to this.
There's a little crossover there. If you didn't know, not everyone knows. Sarah's is kind of in this space, but yeah, there's a little crossover. But it's a wonderful piece here that we're having the discussion all the way around. I'm a really big fan of it. It brings us back to your point, Triad. Like, you nailed it, and now I'm kind of just want to tell people who are listening to the recording, rewind a little bit to Triad, re-listen to it, and that's literally what this paragraph's about. It's just what this paragraph's about. It's great. Bostgerd asks, a quick question which might not actually apply here. Excellent. But with merchant and financial capital being the handmaidens of industrial capital, are there equivalents in the despotic regime? His perverts and paranoia, the people who go from city to city, they're not machines, they're people. I mean, they play the role effectively of it, but those to me would be the equivalents in terms of how it functions and how it organizes remotely, how it plays with that, why it plays. You made the comment earlier of the cynic and the holy man or the pious, and those, I mean, track almost spot on for the people that he talked about during the despotic socius, who would go from town to town. The perverts, I think, is what they referred to them as, actually. But the shift away from people and subjects being the ones kind of doing it, who are playing a role within a machine, to being machines within machines is significant shift. Yes, you could argue all subjects are machines. We have machinic unconscious. I'm more talking about post-subject in the Moeller regime, the machines that are built instead of a subject being a part of and playing a role as determined by their alliances or filiations or their debts or whatever it may be. The shift to being the machine that is just running stuff, that becomes the quasi-cause of all the production that is happening around you, or the elements of why you or your town does what you do. Ultimately, the despotic has, that they have some semblance. And when we get to the next chapter, this next thing I say will make a lot more sense. But the edict of when I write an edict as a despot, and my pervert Jack here, who's in the room, welcome Jack, he walks around and he's got my edict, he lays it out, and everyone goes, oh, cool, I'll go do that because it's written from on high, again, to talk about how representation sort of works within that. At the same time, within capital's literally that. And so it's not a person needing to do it, it's a machine that can do it. And now there's an element that's so universalized, yet still written. And there is that representation in the way that these things are so produced become essentially that same sort of element, it feels like to me.
Thank you for the perverted welcome.
Always happy to have you here, my pervert Jack.
always perverse to be here. But yeah, I think that's part of the move too, right? Is that so one of the big things happening here with the advent of capitalism is, among classical economics is going to be the Keynesian economics that Deleuze and Guattari pick up. So to your point, right, one of the things that's shifting is the multiplier effect, where now it's no longer just prices fluctuating, but you've got quanta in that, right? You've got the potential for a whole different use of the market as multiplication goes, right? And I think what's kind of interesting here is, adding on to your point, through the so if we're advancing from signifier to signified as within the despotic, and now the abstract is going into the referent, right? Kind of using a Holland-esque squint here. What's very interesting in a certain manner is the way that on the body of capital, right, where we find all the appropriation, where everything is re-territorializing, you start to, I think, discover that with these multipliers, and also with the way that money is now transferring, well, I shouldn't say money, that capital is now taking over the alliant and the filiative, right? You've got a whole new construction there, whereby, interestingly enough, the whole grid is shifting into this filiative and alliant coordination based on the way that everything kind of falls back on, I shouldn't say capital, that the way that capital creates the disjunctive synthesis and falls back on the process of production. So what does that mean? Well, that means, like, in a sense, right, like they're using Marx at the end there, we're no longer just talking about father and son, we're talking about father and son in terms of surplus value, and the way that actually is now possible, and perhaps in a sense only immediately possible before we start talking about the BWO in Chapter 4 on the body of capital, where the referent, all the capital, is starting to do some very interesting things to bodies, right?
And I really like this notion. I guess you mentioned it before, Brooks, that we are not dealing with subjects anymore that are acting in a very free or manner, or in the way an agent would do, so to speak. But the subjects are produced by this exchange, this circulation of capital in this system, or in this new body of the socius that is capitalism. And that's exactly what reminded me of Sayre here, because when he's asking in the Parasite, very much at the end, how is even a collective created, or what is a collective? And he's then talking about quasi-objects and quasi-subjects. It is this aspect he's talking about with the example of a ferret and a ball, and with money as the general equivalents, as these jokers that are building up anything with a very highly underdeterminate logic that is very difficult to grasp. So it's this playing of the game of capitalism with this general equivalent of this very undeterminate medium of money and of production, that is this quasi-object constantly exchanging. And it's not like we are controlling these flows of exchange, but we are just like in a play with a ball, for example, in football and soccer, etc. The players are running in relation to the ball that is constantly flying around, passed by, and we try to accumulate it. So this quasi-object becomes that which shapes our behavior and how we act in relation to it. So it is not a Copernican thing, as he says it, but a Ptolemaic revolution again. So we are circling constantly around this general equivalent, and it shapes how we even become a subject, because within this new body of the socius, without money, or without the capacity of production, you're nothing. You're not even a subject anymore. What he then, in a very smug way, points to Descartes when he says that in our times the Cartesian meditations should have been written like something like, I am rich, therefore I am. Money is integrally my being. The real doubt is poverty. Radical doubt is to the extreme is misery, and so on.
So in the capitalist system, the subject is actually what Deleuze says it's constructed based on good sense and common sense, right? Still, and these individuals and persons, right, that are just actualizations of the actualizations in this world, that they're just decoded actualized individuals. So there is a kind of a pseudo subject there, right, of sorts. But for Deleuze, there's no subject anyway, is there?
No, there's a subject. The subject is produced, though, right? That's part of the third synthesis, or if you like to take it, all three syntheses are the production of the subject, right, in those processes.
Yeah. The subject is emergent.
Right. It is not the center or the ground of all these actions, because it is not anymore the subject, or maybe it was never the subject of the Enlightenment, of the subject philosophies before that. The subject, the mind, and the apperception of the eye is the sole ground for everything and of our freedom.
Yeah, the subject's based on irony as opposed to humor, right?
well, and this is why I say you got to be a little careful here. The subject is contingent upon the processes of production, which are on the one hand the three processes of the unconscious, right? So the way the unconscious is producing production, distribution, and consumption and consummation, right? Kind of have that conjoining of the three, of the two terms in that third one. And then you've got the way that the paralogisms factor into that process of production, which aren't produced by the unconscious, but affect the unconscious's production, right? So you've kind of got two things going on there. And where that becomes difficult with, especially with capital associates, as we're starting to see this referent, again, using kind of a Hollandaise squint here. But, we can even take it a little bit further, because it's almost going to appear like a double vision. You start to realize that with the subject's production, right, there is this kind of, this is all upon the surface of capital, right? So that's why the socius plays into this, as opposed to being on the surface of the full body of the despot, the entire constellation of relationships in the despotic socius, right? That full body. We're looking at it now where capital has taken that place. And so, hopping back to make a point, on page 225, all right, they write, at the heart of capital, Marx points to the encounter of two so-called principal elements. On one side, the deterritorialized worker, who has become free and naked, having to sell his labor capacity, and on the other, decoded money that has become capital and is capable of buying it. The fact that these two elements result from the segmentation of the despotic state and feudalism, and from the decomposition of the feudal system itself and that of its state, still do not provide us the astringent conjunction of these two flows, flows of producers and flows of money. So going back to that first part of those two so-called principal elements, right? What you start to have is the deterritorialized worker. The deterritorialized worker, for instance, right? So you've got a body there, but you've also got the body in relation to a kind of body of labor capacity, right? Which is how we're starting to see these quanta in that last paragraph. And then on the other hand, you've got capital, right, capable of buying that quanta, right? So you've got this decoded potentiality. You've got the socius that starts to condition things like money to be able to actually purchase that abstract labor, right? And that's going to take you into, again, this kind of double vision where, when you see a worker, right, you always see the worker and the labor capacity, and you also see the dollar and cents involved. And that is why it's difficult, I think, to maintain that point about the impoverished and the wealth, insofar as everything is only going to be possible through the socius of capital, right? Again, the BWO there's a huge caveat there, but what becomes difficult is the subject is only, and here's my conclusion for you, the subject will only be possible through the socius of capital here. And that makes this very difficult, but also very interesting.
Right, the socius becomes what's called the symbolic order, and it creates the common sense and good sense that constructs what the subject is, right?
It constructs and organizes production. The way that production interacts, out of that, representations get built. Because I know what you're connecting. You're connecting this straight over to logic, a sense. Because I'm in the readings with you too, and I don't think you're far off in how you're talking through this. That I wouldn't say necessarily symbolic order. There's some worrying words with that, thanks to Lacan and a few other people who use those terms. But instead, if we think about it as the great machine that organizes and places desire in front of itself, and it organizes society, organizes labor, organizes flows, codes flows, this massive machine that is doing such things, those elements are what it's doing. And as it's doing so, because it is effectively the BWO of society, that is what the socius really is, as such, it through its own sort of emergent properties of as a socius, it is able to, or the subject or representations develop outside of that based on the elements and connections it has on its own full body. So the organization of all kinds of elements on the socius, the recordings of, are what lead to the good and common sense that you're talking about, that he's deeply so critical of inside of logic of sense. So there's a few extra steps in the same way that I would say for the subject, in the way that he talks about it through AO, how I determine who Brooks is, like the true Brooks, the real Brooks, not just the everyday Brooks, the good Brooks versus the common Brooks, you might say, that carries over almost directly to how the socius operates to create good and common truths that everyone seems to know. I mean, God, you don't know such things? That's the natural way. Well, what created it? I don't know. Like it said, blah, 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 did that. Like it becomes its own sort of quasi-cause producing such things. Does that answer a little bit, JK? That's my understanding of it, at least.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Yeah, pretty much. To borrow from Lacan again, he has this the master signifier, right? Is that maybe so? He's saying that the despotic Earthstat is the master signifier that perhaps continues, right, underneath the socius of capitalism, in some form, but in the kind of submerged, latent form, maybe.
I think maybe he might have used some of those terms. The difficulty here is we're talking about like nothing that's transcendent, and a master signifier implies transcendence in a few ways. So for here, it's less that, it's more. If we think of everything as processual and machinic, that the elements within, as they're interacting, slamming into each other and working, breaking down fits and starting again, all together, just like desiring machines, it's not one desiring machine that creates a subject. It's the millions of them over time doing, connecting, disconnecting, recording, connecting, disconnecting, recording. And as that recording happens, the next step is an emergent pattern sort of gets created that is the subject. The subject has their understanding of the world, that it becomes their body without organs as things are layered onto each other, as singularities are sort of experienced, and they become the truths that I lie out in front of me. These ideas become my actual. In the same case, when I have my subjectivity and I'm walking out in the world, the schizophrenic going for a walk, as I do that, if I run into other schizophrenics on the way or other people, as I'm running into other people, those interactions, those connections and disconnections through various forms also record. And if they happen to record in, say, hundreds of millions of people or billions of them, as we have in our world today, the thing that is emergent out of that, just like subjectivity, is the socius. And that social grouping, all of us together, also has its recording and its BWO that are singularities that everyone has experienced that then have that appeal towards good and common sense. The whole thing is essentially processual and procedural and machinic from beginning to end, without any, like, this was already here, or here's how it has to be organized. It's like, this comes from, like, it starts from a single movement, one rock colliding into another billions of years ago. And then over time, these things start sort of emerging out of such a process of life. That may have been a version. If I were high, I should probably say that. Maybe that didn't make any sense. It sounded like I was coming down from an acid trip almost. I don't think it's wrong. I don't think it's wrong, though. I think that's a decent summary, maybe. Yeah, I haven't smoked weed in, like, seriously, like 9 months. I have no excuse for my ramble just now. No, I'm going to read the next paragraph. Actually, God, I almost don't want to. This is the fucking math paragraph.
We're losing you, Brooks. You're fading in and out.
No, it's because I'm putting my head in my hands because I'm just sitting here like, oh crap. The next paragraph is the differential relations and math shit that my brain can't do. Is anyone here comfortable with this stuff? Because I'm going to read it and then someone else is going to have to explain this one because I don't get the math part of this. So I'm hoping someone here is smart. So I'm going to start reading.
Before you do that,
okay.
and I'm no differential calculus, but I can kind of help out here because from the economic standpoint, I kind of understand what they're talking about. You know, like the Lagrange equation, all that. Really, what we need is a different that's fair. But just to go back to your connection logic sense, just be careful there because you don't want to risk identifying the socius entirely with the symbolic any more than common and good sense, because any paradox and the production of the real, which is desire, right? Those have a contingent relationship with the socius. So like this is what I was saying with like the I'm kind of maybe levying a critique against the impoverished and the rich thing. You know, wherever doubt is in that, doubt will be contingent and conditioned by that socius. Any paradox, any revolutionary investment will be contingent on capital as socius for our purposes in capital as socius. So just be careful as you're trying to make those connections, especially like quasi-cause coming out of the operator section and the place that quasi-cause has in logic of sense. Be very attentive to those details because if you're going to make those connections, which you should, there are some challenges there, because I think one of the hard things about Anti-Oedipus is that, if we're doing this affirmative critique in that, it's no longer going to be sufficient, as in some strands of Marxism in that, right, to simply put down capital, because any way out of capital will be contingent upon capital, similar to how logic of sense's inversion of Platonism is contingent upon Platonism, right? But we can go beyond Platonism, but at the same time, that still relies on Platonism, The other thing I was going to say is, with the master signifier, pay close attention to how things work here, like Brooks was saying with the processes, because if we take the master signifier in terms of the first and second paralogisms, right, where this partial object detaches and now part of the signifying chain detaches and becomes the master signifier, right? First and second paralogisms on that will be in relation to the socius, and that's going to be interesting, especially as we start to see these abstract decoded differential flows, right? Which is exactly where Brooks is going to take us. Much to his chagrin.
Yes, to my differential calculus paragraph. It is solely under these conditions that capital becomes the full body, the new socius or the quasi-cause that appropriates all the productive forces. We are no longer in the domain of the quantum or of the quantitas, but in that of the differential relation as a conjunction that defines the immanent social field particular to capitalism and confers on the abstraction as such its effectively concrete value, its tendency to concretization. The abstraction has not ceased to be what it is, but it no longer appears in the simple quantity as a variable relation between independent terms. It has taken upon itself the independence, the quality of the terms, and the quantity of the relations. The abstract itself posits the more complex relation, within which it will develop like something concrete. This is the differential relation dy dx, where dy derives from labor power and constitutes the fluctuation of variable capital, and where dx derives from capital itself and constitutes the fluctuation of constant capital. The definition of constant capital by no means excludes the possibility of a change in the value of its constituent parts. It is from the fluxion of decoded flows, from their conjunction, that the filiative form of capital, x plus dx, results. The differential relation expresses the fundamental capitalist phenomenon of the transformation of the surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux. The fact that a mathematical appearance here replaces the old code simply signifies that one is witnessing a breakdown of the subsisting codes and territorialities for the benefit of a machine of another species, functioning in an entirely different way. This is no longer the cruelty of life, the terror of one life brought to bear against another life, but a Post-mortem despotism, the despot become anus and vampire. Quote, capital is dead labor, that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. End quote. Industrial capital thus offers a new filiation that is a constituent part of the capitalist machine, in relation to which commercial capital and financial capital will now take the form of a new alliance by assuming specific functions.
I suppose I'll kick it off then, right? So if I remember my calculus correctly, and I do not profess to be a calculus expert, but I'll give it a shot. Basically, what we're talking about with differentials is the rate of change. So we're looking at, if I'm not mistaken, the rate of change of variable y versus in proportion to the rate of change of variable x, right? And I'll get to that in a second, which is ultimately going to give us the calculation for the rate of change of flux going on here. All right, so far simple enough. So if we go through here, right, so what is y and what is x? Always got to define your terms in math, even when the code is breaking down, like they say, right? Even though we're dealing with some mathematical relations here, it doesn't mean that meaning is gone, right? But it has changed in a sense it is breaking down, because it's right decoding in that. So we've got, so we're out of the domain of quantum and quantitas. My Latin's never been very good either. But now we're in the differential relation as a conjunction. It's very important because that's our first synthesis. So this differential relationship is going to be the process of production, right? So in our stages of production, our syntheses, we're in production, right? Before we get into distribution and consummation consumption. So we're looking at basically how on the grid work two things are coming together and the way partial objects are implicated in that, right? So they go on to write, but in that of the differential relation is conjunction that defines the immanent social field, particularly capitalism. So it defines the social body associates, right? It's our grid work once again, and confers on the abstraction as such. Its effectively concrete value, its tendency to concretization. So right, we're back to that, like this double vision of things. Like on the one hand, it does look abstract. On the other hand, it is concretizing, right? The territorialization is taking place, and bodies are changing as part of this. So to go right into it then, quality of terms. The abstract itself posits the more complex relation within which it will develop, quote, like, end quote, something concrete. So nice caveat to what I just said there. Again with the double vision. This is the differential relation. Differential of y over differential of x. So just a basic proportion, where the differential of y derives from labor power and constitutes the fluctuation of variable capital. So on the one hand, right, we're back to that deterritorialized labor power. That's like in relation to bodies and that, right? So we've got the way that changes, that labor power and its capacities corresponds to the fluctuation of variable capital, right? So the way that, so if you take this in a financial sense, your variable capital versus your fixed capital, so changing capital versus capital held constant, if you like. Keeping it very as simple as we can. And where d of x derives from capital itself, it constitutes the fluctuation of constant capital. Quote, the definition of constant capital by no means excludes the possibility of a change in the value of its constituent parts. So just because we're talking about fixed capital, or if we want to keep it simple, fixed cost and fixed revenue, right? That doesn't mean things can't change within the assemblage, and fixed cost can't change, or fixed capital can't change. But we are basically talking about how capital and its valuation, even though there's a flux happening, there's a fixed element to it, right? And I think this is connecting up with the filiative. Yeah, the filiative. Oh, I'm sorry. It's from the conjunction of this, the filiative results. Okay. But just in that, insofar as I've tried to sketch out what those two things are, is that a comfortable explanation? Are there either criticisms or questions or comments? So if I said, like, when you go for job interviews, right, and you're looking at the way that your labor power translates into the market, right, you've got the variable aspect in relation to the labor market, but you've also got the fixed elements that go into that, right? So the way that those have the potential to fluctuate, and that fluctuation itself produces the total flux that becomes the filiative here, right? I think that's in a nutshell what they're an example of what they're getting at, just in terms of if you've ever experienced looking for a job.
Also, please go on.
Yeah, could you explain the part that says x plus dx? What does that mean?
Right, and that's exactly where I left off. So if you're taking the differential of x, right? So this is your coordinates, right? X-axis, y-axis. What's going on the x-axis is your x. Again, for our purposes. So whatever x is, you're talking about taking x plus the rate of change of x, right?
Okay.
And that's going to be your denominator in the ratio, right? So fixed capital, usually it helps to have a constant denominator, as we would even say colloquially, right? That's the common denominator in all of this madness, right? They're basically talking about fixed capital plus its rate of change, right? D of x, that differential, producing the filiative form of capital, which is your grid work.
So when you derive dx from x, the derivative of it, it's you look at the specific variable on the line, and it gives you the rate, how it, as Jack mentioned, how it changes or how steep the curve goes down or up. And by that, you look at specific points, and by that, you try to describe the fluctuation, or better, the behavior of the whole segment, so to speak. So you can try to look at the different relationships between variables in this sense, with differential relationships. So how different things change in relation to other things, and how they affect each other. So you're not only looking for a specific value, but for how things develop in relation to other things. And that's why it's such a powerful tool in relation to the description of dynamical systems, for example, in physics, or maybe in medicine, in economics and other fields.
Yeah, that's spot on, because with the differential of x and the differential of y, so we've got our two variables which are changing, or differentiating. Well, I don't have the background in DNR to say that, which are changing. And so in that way, right, we can work with two variables that are changing while still being able to work with the two variables in sort of their x and y form, right?
I'm gonna have to watch some YouTube videos and join a high school AP course on calculus. I think it's a challenge for me. The math shit is a significant challenge for me.
I don't mean to be Berkeley-esque here, but you probably already you probably.
I get the idea. I get the concept here. I get the concept of the paragraph. Because the last time we went through it, the last two times, but especially the first time we went through it, but also this last time, the discussion we had around this, we dove in very deep. I get the conception here, because it's about the rate at which quantities change, no longer being just a simple addition of this labor added with that flow, out you come with the Y, that there's significant growth here, that part of this is one of the things that stems towards the accelerationist movement, the accelerational potential of capital, how capital moves, how these things flow. I get the conception here, I get the implications. I just can't wrap my head literally around the the sentences, and it's a frustrating thing. But it is.
I feel you. Yeah.
But it's so the most important to me, like this paragraph's great, but again, and thank you all for the explanations. It's helped a little bit, but it's the one line in there, the idea that capital is dead labor, and Vampire Light only lives by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks.
Right.
Like that is a very
that's a
beautiful
point I wanted to get to, because as they describe this transformation of the surplus value of code to the surplus value of flux, and I really like this expression of post-mortem despotism, and the despot become anus and vampire. So at the same time, it shits out this fruits of the labor and sucks on it. So we have this capitalistic notion of not only you trade something like they described before, this cruelty of life, you lose one thing and you get another, so one has to die so the other lives. No, it is this thing that capitalism lives off the labor that is already done and was traded for something, for example, but it really tries to suck on this more and more to speculate on the future, on some exchange to get out of it more and more, even though nothing more by the capitalist itself, so to speak, is produced, but it's only trying to suck off the energy from its surrounding and the labor work.
Yeah, and this is really a nice, if I call it a critique, you might be perceived negatively, but it is a nice critique of Marxism insofar as it actually expanded the understanding of surplus value here, right? Because at least in my copy, what's italicized, the differential relation expresses the fundamental capitalist phenomenon of the transformation of the surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux. So, I mean, at some level, right, the surplus value in Marxism, I think, does have a certain flux that it's kind of intuitive. But I mean, especially what's going on here, where they're talking about how we're seeing how the socius is going from the surplus value of code, because the socius is the socii of the old had to deal with, right, coding and overcoding, where surplus value of coding made a lot of intuitive sense, right? To now the problem of decoding, where all of a sudden, with this new relationship of coding and decoding, you have this flux that's possible, right? An immense capacity of changeability, if you like, all through what's here, right, going to be d of y and d of x, or the filiative, the alliant over the filiative, right? Or at least what's going to produce the alliant over the filiative.
Let's, at this point, I'd love to just take a moment and, because I think we're going to start closing out and continue this paragraph. This next paragraph we'll move forward into next week, because I think there's enough left in this, at least, for us to continue moving forward. Oh, for fuck's sake. Yeah, we've got enough room. This is going to take a couple weeks. Maybe we'll do more next week, but we're definitely going to continue from here.